All right, so good morning. So I'm Jeff Middleton, mental health liaison with the Rancho Unified School District. And I'll be here presenting with Sandra, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Sandra Robles, Program Specialist for Student Services. Nice to be here this morning with all of you.
So today we'll be talking specifically about trauma, students who are exposed to traumatic events, specifically how it impacts their, like how they experience school, and that students who have been exposed to trauma may experience school differently. So we'll be looking at a few things, so focusing specifically on understanding their experience, what might have occurred that leads to a trauma reaction. What is a trauma reaction? We're going to focus a lot today on complex trauma. So there's simple traumas and complex traumas. So we'll spend a good amount of time on complex trauma to kind of understand how that might impact our students, or how it impacts young people who are exposed to traumatic events. We'll learn about the impact on the physiology of the brain and sort of how that plays out and changes the neurons and the physiology of the organic structures. We'll recognize the effects of trauma on students, parents, staff, and schools, and look at trauma-informed practices. So it's going to be a combination today of what is trauma, what does it look like, how does it impact people, and what can we do to support our students in the classroom to have to be able to access the curriculum and to progress academically and social emotionally. So Sandra will be speaking at the end more specifically about what we can do in the classroom to impact or to support our students. So firstly, if you could write in the chat box, what are some examples of events that may lead to a trauma reaction? So please share in the chat box, and Sandra will be monitoring that, reading off what you're writing. So what are any type of events, things that might occur to somebody that might lead to a trauma reaction? I think you're muted, Sandra.
Sorry. DCFS removal from the home, abuse, physical and sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, witnessing a murder, traumatic loss, racism.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great examples. So go ahead.
Community violence.
Yeah. So we're talking about, abuse, talking about, so, and I heard the first one being a removal by DCFS, who talked about, if they're going to be removed, it usually means there's some type of neglect, that happens, some, general or severe neglect, which can be traumatizing, or some type of abuse. And then the experience of being removed in and of itself, can be traumatic. So I heard community violence, so exposure to, witnessing or seeing, especially if it's somebody who you're attached to, you feel connected to, and even especially if it's somebody who's your primary caregiver, who you rely on as a secure base. So that's a really important concept that we'll be coming back to, this idea of secure base, those relationships that we feel attached to or connected to, and when those get disrupted, or if that person is the one that's creating or causing some of the traumatic events involved in it, it has a special impact as opposed to those we don't know or we're seeing. So community violence, maybe we don't see them, but we're exposed to it and it impacts us in a way. But then if it involves somebody that we're part of our family or really close to or rely on for survival in some way, shape, or form, it has an even greater impact. And so we're going to focus a lot on that today around complex trauma, and that means exposure to multiple events of it. So we'll get more into that in a bit. Thank you for sharing. Some of the different types of trauma, we'll go through this quickly, but natural disaster, so losing your home, things changing, that kind of chaos, accidents, wars, terrorism, these can all cause trauma reactions, community violence, robberies, shootings, school violence, so being involved in that, or being near, or even knowing about it. So a lot of our students are hearing about what's going on in America throughout the last few years, and having a reaction as they go to school. It affects everybody differently. So we'll be talking more about that as we go along. Family trauma. So this is a lot of what we were talking about: abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence. In the past, if a child witnessed domestic violence, it wasn't even reportable at some point in the history. Now it is, because we're realizing witnessing domestic violence can have just as much psychological consequences as physical or sexual abuse. So that's why it's now reportable if we witness it. Refugee and immigrant trauma. So the amount moving over, that type of exposure toward just the migration and acculturation process, feeling overwhelmed and scared. Medical trauma, poverty, and racial trauma. So I think that was mentioned earlier as well. So exposure to discrimination, institutional racism, having that traumatic impact, which is becoming more and more. There's a lot more awareness to this type of trauma that's happening in our society, and some really great movements around that. So these are just some examples of types of trauma. COVID-19, has been a distressing event for us as we go through this, and including that as something that can either, whether it creates trauma or exacerbates already preconditions. Some of our students that we're working with have family members who have passed away. Some have very vulnerable family members. Just knowing about what's happening, about how many people have died from this, and just being scared overall, can have a negative impact on sort of the physiology and the worldview. And so when we don't know when or if, so it's like that anticipatory thing. I don't know if it's going to happen. It's not predictable. So we'll get into later the importance of predictability for our sort of well-being, and how we can support those who've had exposure to trauma. But COVID-19 has really thrown predictability out the window for a little while, and has had a big impact on our young people in particular. So just looking at some of the things: separating from families, loved ones not being able to connect, like grandparents, for example. Routines have all changed. There is a higher rate of domestic violence that's occurring right now as people are quarantined or staying at home. So there's a lot more, unfortunately, more calls, to the police around this issue, which means that our young people are being exposed to it, and we're having decreased reports of child abuse overall nationwide. And some of the reasons for that is that they're not coming to school, so they're not in a sort of more private space where they can talk about what's happening to them. They're not sharing with teachers. Mental health is available, but not as widely as available as it once was. So those reports are down. So we're not sure on all the numbers, but it seems to be apparent that our students or young people are being exposed to domestic violence at a higher rate, than before, and that's concerning. Absolutely. Like I said, lack of routines, worried about getting sick, worried about other people getting sick, financial worries, loss of work. We were talking about poverty earlier, evictions. I know there's some protections around that, but just the fear of that hanging over. So that instability and unpredictability around basic needs, and the impact that can have. So we're going to focus. So the definition of childhood trauma, as defined by Lenore Tur, is one that we're going to use. The result of one sudden external blow or a series of blows rendering the person temporarily helpless, breaking past ordinary coping and defense operations. So this is a very important piece to just determining whether somebody's having a trauma reaction. Just because somebody's exposed to something does not mean that they're going to have a trauma reaction, or have the symptoms of complex trauma, PTSD. We've all been exposed to different types. The things that we've written about, we've all been exposed to them. Some of us have coping structures, or it doesn't surpass our threshold to handle them, to cope with them. But when we're exposed to something that's beyond that ability, that's when these kind of different symptoms that we're going to talk about more come up for especially young people who, as the younger you are, the less coping strategies you have to deal with life's challenges, the less sort of cognitive ability you have to understand the world and what's going on in it to make sense of it. So you have to kind of rely on more primitive defenses or coping strategies that sometimes can aren't enough to sort of manage or cope the challenges that they're dealing with. So it's important to remember that not all adverse reactions lead to a traumatic event. That children are also resilient as well. So that is an important factor in as we're determining who needs support. So once again, just because they're exposed doesn't mean that they absolutely need it, but we're going to assess and follow up. So prevalence of childhood trauma. So 2 out of 3 children and youth were exposed to violence in the last year. So once again, just because they're exposed doesn't mean they absolutely have trauma reaction, but that's a very high rate. So of these, 50% report more than one form of victimization. So like I said, we're going to get into complex trauma. These things can happen multiple times. And then, the ACEs study did some really amazing work, sort of longitudinal studies looking at the fact that 1 in 5 adults report 3 or more adverse experiences as children. And the ACEs study is really looking at the impact of exposure, not just on our psychological well-being, but on our physical well-being. And that those types of, adverse experiences can lead to higher rates of diabetes and other sort of physical issues, heart issues, as a result of exposure to those environmental factors. So that's been a really amazing study. So this kind of takes us through a little more details about it. 8% have experienced, so looking at young people, 8% have experienced sexual assault, 16% cyberbullying, 17% physical assault, 39% witness violence. And those in low socioeconomic areas are at a higher rate, are exposed at a higher rate than higher socioeconomic areas. So youth of color also, so ages 12 to 19, also exposed to higher rates of traumatic events. So African American youth living in urban low-income communities, American Indian, Alaskan, children with disabilities, refugees, LGBTQ youth. So all are higher risk of exposure to childhood trauma. So these are important factors. So, we're going to look at, so PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, that is the diagnosis that's in the DSM-5. So we're going to talk a little bit about PTSD, but we're going to mainly focus on acute trauma or type 1 and or type 2 complex trauma. So acute trauma, type 1 is exposure to one single event, so like a car accident or a robbery that happened. So it's a one-time thing. Particularly, from somebody that you don't know. And the prognosis is usually, the recovery time, it's usually pretty good. You're able to recover, from those types of events over a period of time. Some require professional help to move through those events, especially if you've been exposed to previous traumas growing up. Then a single incident can have a longer lasting impact and kind of bring up all the old experiences. So we're going to focus today on type 2 or complex trauma, so the experience of multiple and or chronic and prolonged developmentally adverse traumatic events, most often of an interpersonal nature. So that's what I was speaking to earlier. So child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, these are all things with people who are supposed to keep us safe, and the experience is not that. So so that has a different kind of impact. PTSD and the diagnosis was really created around those that were returning from war, adults returning from war. So it was looking at, sort of later exposure to traumatic events. So as, somebody who's 18 and above, and what their sort of responses to exposure to war. So complex trauma and the child traumatic stress network, where a lot of this information comes from, is in Bessel van der Kolk's work. The Body Keeps the Score, which is a fantastic book. So it focuses more on like the differences between children who are exposed at a young age. There's a lot of crossover, but there are some things that are specific to young people exposed to multiple events. So that's what we're going to emphasize more today. I'm going to keep coming back to this idea because I think this is a really, really important concept. So natural child development process. So if a child grows up without threat, they are naturally drawn toward novelty, challenge, and feedback. This is just what children do overall for the most part. It's most children. So the question that we're talking about today is what happens if a child grows up with threat. So the example I give in this is that if you've ever taken say a 3-year-old to the park, so they'll often run to a certain distance and they'll turn around and they'll look back and they'll see if whoever's taking care of them, that's whoever they're attached to, their secure base, that relationship, whoever's there, whether it's a parent or babysitter or aunt, uncle, grandparent, they'll look back, they'll see who that person is, or if they're there. And if they see that they're there, they're off running. They're learning, they're outgrowing, they're novelty, challenge, and feedback. They're seeing, can I jump, from this stone to that stone? Can I climb across the monkey bar? They're feeling what grass feels like against their face and what sand tastes like. And, they're learning about the world around them. They're challenging themselves and they're growing, right? They're learning, which is what, at school we're obviously all about. What happens if they turn around and the person that brought them there is gone, is no longer there, is maybe thought it would be funny to hide behind a tree or something? What happens to that child? Automatically, there's panic. There's anxiety, crying, fear. All the child wants to do is find that secure base, reestablish, and regulate themselves again through the relationship of the secure base, so that they can kind of bring themselves back down to equilibrium. But in that moment, they're no longer interested in learning. Learning is, they don't want to see if they can jump from here to there and see what grass tastes like or sand. They don't, that has not even crossed their mind. They're not interested in it because they are in a state of dysregulation. And so they have to establish a sense of safety first. So that overrides everything. Once they come back and they establish, okay, and they say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have hid behind the tree. I'm okay, I'll stand right here and watch you. They can go back out and learn and grow again. And so this is a really important factor when we're talking about school and exposure to trauma, that learning cannot take place if somebody feels unsafe. The brain isn't wired that way. Once the child felt unsafe, the part of the brain, and we'll get into more detail about it, that focuses on learning, is no longer active. All that's there is the survival and establishment of safety. So we're going to focus on what happens for children that are exposed to threat, particularly threat over and over and over again, and how that changes their physiology and worldview. So complex trauma at its core is really about a breakdown in our ability to regulate internal states. So as when we're born, those of us who've been around infants know that babies are not born with the ability to regulate their emotions. So something comes up and they're crying, and they learn how to regulate emotions through the security of the attachment bond with the primary caregiver. And that helps them mitigate against trauma-induced terror. And it is terror because they're so vulnerable and they rely on their caregiver for their survival. So it really is their survival is on the line if their needs are not met. So a caregiver is typically able to restore a sense of safety, through picking up and holding or feeding or meeting whatever need that child has, particularly around accurate mirroring. So if the child is hungry, they're able to, provide food for them. If they need to be, held, they pick them up and hold them. This is where we learn how to regulate our emotions. So, the child's crying, they're in a state of dysregulation, and ideally a parent comes, caregiver picks them up, and they're able to kind of stay regulated, at least most of the time. And the child learns or kind of downloads, how do I regulate through that relationship, through the parent cooing or staying calm or just kind of feeding and taking care of them. That's how we learn how to regulate our emotions, through that experience. So some of our young people or children have had different kinds of experiences growing up. So maybe, really anxious, or their needs weren't being met, or they were kind of, left neglected. So they didn't learn how to regulate that. And so they have kind of a disorganized system around how to regulate emotions. So they can't that's that part we're talking about, the threshold or the coping strategies. And we'll talk a little more about what young people do, in order to try to regulate their emotions using sort of primitive functions. So if caregivers do not respond to the needs of the child, what ends up resulting is difficulty relying on others for support. So you kind of, can develop a worldview that I'm sort of out here on my own, and I have to figure things out, and I can't rely on other people to meet my needs, to take care of me. So I don't, go to others for help. Difficulty regulating emotions, as we discussed. Difficulty attaining a sense of safety and control. So the fight or flight response gets triggered around that. So adrenaline and cortisol starts running through the body at a young age, because of the terror or the risk of danger. And we'll talk a little bit more about the impact of that constant fight or flight, response, or being stuck in that state for long periods of time. So unmanagedly stressed children often dissociate. So this is the most primitive defense structure we have, and it's an important one, because if they didn't do that, they would just be stuck in that terror-induced state. So dissociation kind of checks them out. They get to kind of go into another space, and where it feels kind of safe. So it's almost like the outside world here isn't safe, so I'm going to go inward and find a world in which I can feel safe. Dissociation takes place all the time. So some of you may be dissociating right now as we're talking. It's a normal thing. We check out, we kind of think about other things, we kind of zone in and out. And that is a normal human function. But for some of our, those who have been exposed to it, they spend large amounts of time checking out or dissociating. And then we begin to go to school. And school can be very anxiety provoking. So once we get, dysregulated, for those who are, have been exposed to trauma, they may be checking out for big portions of their schooling experience. So if you think about sort of progression of time, so if we're dissociated or checked out, and those around us are not, they're progressing emotionally and cognitively, they're developing. And if you're checked out for a large portion of that time, you start falling behind, socially, emotionally, physically, academically, and then it's hard to catch up at that point. So many of us know young people who maybe are chronologically 12, but they maybe emotionally feel like 8 or 9 or sometimes even younger than that. Now there's many explanations for why that occurs for folks. But this is one possibility that can be happening. I think is an important factor. Predictability and continuity are critical in developing causality. So as we begin to develop our ideas about the world and whether I have control over the outside world, so that predictability. So if I cry, I get a response from the parent or caregiver to come meet my need, right? And so then I begin to kind of go, okay, well, I have some power and control over the outside world. The causality that comes up, I begin to kind of understand cause and effect at a really foundational level. But if I'm crying and no one comes, but sometimes they come when I'm not, or sometimes I get fed when I'm not hungry, or sometimes nothing comes at all, the world starts becoming very, very disorganized, random. And it feels random. And so so that development of that internal representation of the world. So it's like living without a map. You don't know where to go. It's almost like, the example I usually give is, if you've ever been lost. I mean, we have GPS now, but maybe those who drove around before that or went around before that, in an area that you didn't know at night, all you were looking for was something familiar. And it was very scary. You didn't know where to go. You're just trying to find where you've been before, or anything familiar that you can grab onto, anything predictable, so that you can create a map and try to create causality. So a lot of our young people exposed to this are growing up without a map, without that internal representation. Not sure if this leads to that, and not understanding the predictability of the world, or what is predictable and what isn't. It's confusing. Creates less insight. And then going back to this part about difficulty asking for help and processing feelings. Difficulty appreciating novelty. So without a map, you don't want to go anywhere. Like when you're lost, you don't want to go into new neighborhoods. You want to go back to the one that you know. And then maybe you can go kind of venture slowly into new places and then come back, just like the child in the park. So the best example I have of this is when I was working in Oakland, at Children's Hospital Oakland. We had a program where we were doing some field visits, or taking young people out on field trips, and we had planned a trip to the Santa Cruz beach boardwalk. And some of the young people we were working with, who had a lot of exposure to trauma and community violence, they were like, we don't want to go. We don't want to go to the beach. And so we were sitting with them. Okay, well, tell us a little bit more about that. They're like, well, we don't know that area. We don't know what clothes and colors to wear. We don't know, what streets to go down and what not to. So, as you zoom out, basically what they're saying is, we prefer to stay in an area of California that is one of the epicenters of homicide rates in California. We feel safer here than going to the beach boardwalk, which has lower rates of violence. And the reason for that is because they know that area. They know where to go, where not to go, what to look for, and so they have that sense, and they don't want to go to anywhere, where it's novel. How it ended up working out was that, we processed it with them. We did end up going on the trip, but it was all based off of trust of us. We had to develop trust with them. So that, once again, going back to that relationship that mitigated and helped them to regulate. Now, they were anxious, particularly at the beginning of the trip, but, as it went along. But the reason why they went was because they developed that trust with us, that we would keep them safe and it would be okay. And then they got there and they went to the ocean, and some of them had never been to the ocean before. And they sat and stared that a while and talked about sharks and things like that. They eventually went in. By the end of the day, had a fantastic time. But it was that novelty that was hard to kind of overcome, because they didn't know, they weren't able to predict everything like that. So the development of a view of the world that incorporates betrayal and hurt. So exposure. So some that are exposed to trauma, they begin to just expect it, or it's like they're looking out for it all the time. It's like the concept of calm before the storm. If things are relaxed, that's a scary time, right? I don't know what's going to happen. I assume that people are going to let me down, hurt me. That people can't be relied on to meet my needs. So that's sort of the worldview, and as a result, can easily misinterpret events in the direction of harm and helplessness. So constantly being on guard, and loss of trust in caretakers that they'll be able to take care of us. So there's that saying, some kind of an old saying, which is interesting ones in areas with like high levels of violence, or those who've been exposed. Concept of like been caught slipping. I've heard that term used before, which is, I know I'm probably butchering it, I know for sure, but the idea is something bad happened to you, and you should have been on guard at all times. You should be paying attention. You can't just kind of relax and feel safe and trust your environment. That you have to be constantly vigilant, hyper vigilant about the world around you. And the impact of that type of vigilance, or just constantly scanning, really impacts our relationships and our worldview, and the physiology of the brain, as we'll get to. I'm going to show a video that was developed. So I developed this video years ago. I copied it so many times that now it's a little wonky, but it kind of gets the basic concept across. So what I would ask is that, so two things. One, when I play this video, if you can play it as loud as possible on your computer to have the full effect of the video. It's about like say 5 minutes or so. And just notice while you're watching it, any thoughts or feelings that come up for you as you're viewing the video. So some of the things to emphasize around the video. So firstly, obviously it was the same video on both ends, but your experience of the first video may have been different in the second one. So it's kind of noticing any thoughts or feelings that came up the first time, and the second time, for me, maybe because I watched Jaws when I was really young and it was a traumatic event for me. It always gets my adrenaline going. I start feeling, I can feel it inside my body. I'm kind of, I'm starting to breathe a little faster. My heartbeat is beating a little bit more. Um, I'm expecting something bad to happen, and I've seen this a million times. And even still, I kind of in my brain, even though logically I know it's the same video, I still kind of have this sensation or feeling that something bad's about to happen. Um, especially I think when that one student in the black, so when it kind of gets to a crescendo, in the black hoodie comes around, or the sweatshirt comes around. I know that he's a really nice kid, but so I even know him, but even in that moment, I'm just thinking something bad's going to happen to him. The way that I'm observing those that are streaming by changes. It's different. I kind of think they have bad, intentions, or that something's going to pop out. Something different's going to happen. So the idea around this video is that some of our students come to school with shark music playing inside of them. And some days it's really loud, and they have and it's just they're just walking around with that idea, with that experience and feeling. And some days maybe it's less so, or something gets triggered and they're back in that state, and they have that shark music inside, which impacts your safety. And going back to the learning piece, and the thing is, we can't tell by looking at a student what type of history they've had, what type of exposure they've had, what's happening inside of them. We can't hear their shark music, so that's what's tricky or challenging. So it's as Sandra's going to get more into how to actually apply these concepts in our work with our students. But I think one part is that we'll emphasize a lot is remembering that this could be what's going on for a student. And so what can I do to reestablish safety, and develop, so that we can have school or our relationship be a secure base for that student, to kind of help, reduce that, and asking the question, rather than like, what's wrong with this person, thinking like, what happened to them, in their life. So, and we'll get more into that later. So right now I want to talk a little bit about the physiology of the brain. So as you know, the brain mediates all emotional, cognitive, behavioral, social, and psychological functioning. And going back to this concept, we must have safety and attachment to learn, and that's really supported by our brain structures. So if the brain perceives threat, it's going to utilize this bottom portion of the brain, which is our survival part. That part will be very, very active, and not the frontal lobe, which is our area of the brain where we're learning. When we're exposed to multiple incidents of trauma in particular, it does impact our memory, and I'll get into how that works. So the best way I can is to use my fist as a model for the brain. So I'll be referring to this. So if you think about like where my knuckles are, that's the sort of frontal lobe up here. And if this bottom part here will be like the spinal cord, and sort of more like the referred to as like the reptilian brain, or the sort of feeling brain. We're going to focus a lot though on this part in the middle, where my thumb is, almost like the end of my thumb, which is right in the center of the brain. This is our center of our limbic system. So the limbic system is the part of the brain that monitors for safety, basically, and it helps set off our fight or flight to protect us or prepare us for a dangerous situation. So it's an important function. Right now, when I'm talking to you and you're sitting wherever you're sitting, all of this information and data is entering into your, through your eyes and your ears, and it's funneling through your amygdala and your hippocampus, the limbic system parts. And it's it's filtering for anything that's dangerous. And if there's danger involved, then it's going to trigger a different part of the brain. And if it determines that there's no danger, it's going to allow our frontal lobe functions to move forward. So our amygdala, like I said, is right in the center here. It's an almond-shaped part of the brain, and it regulates fear and emotion, and it's what sets off the fight or flight response. An important part of this piece is that if the brain is exposed to very high levels of stress over and over again throughout, especially starting at a young age, what can happen is that amygdala starts to swell. And so a swelled amygdala becomes hyperreactive. So it can get triggered really easily. It can set off the fight or flight and kind of get that the system rolling. It becomes very sensitive and gets triggered more, which creates more stress hormone, more cortisol and adrenaline, which creates more swelling. So you kind of get into this cycle. So the next part of the brain to kind of is right next to it is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus plays a really, really important function in terms of memory. Probably the best example I've heard is that the reason why we can't remember things before the age of like 3-4 years old is because the hippocampus is not fully developed yet. So it allows things to be entered into long-term storage and plays a really, really important function when it comes to memory. But the hippocampus also kind of filters things. It's kind of comparing, any stimuli that we're involved in or environment to any previous, environment. So the example I give is, I've seen the movie Boys in the Hood, and in that movie, there's a scene where there's a drive-by shooting by an individual in a red car, and so the hippocampus is going to remember, red car, and so it's going to kind of save that in the memory. And when a red car is seen, it's going to trigger the amygdala that there's danger out there in the world. So it kind of stores that so that it doesn't have to go into long-term storage, which can delay our ability to respond quickly to previously experienced danger. It provides that immediate response to kind of get us prepared. So the hippocampus, if it's exposed to lots of cortisol and stress hormone adrenaline, it actually starts to dwindle a bit. So the neurons start to kind of get less, there's less of them, which means that the memories become less, acute. So to be able to determine a danger. So in the example of the Boys in the Hood example, if I'm exposed to that situation, and I have a hippocampus that the dendrites have dwindled as a result of overexposure to adrenaline. It's like they're kind of fried. I may not be able to I might start generalizing dangers much more. So in the example, it's a red car, and that story took place in South LA. If I have a hippocampus that doesn't have that acute memory, somebody could walk by me with a red sweatshirt really fast, and the hippocampus might not be able to go, okay, that's a red sweatshirt. We're in Pico Rivera. That's not, that's not the situation. It might just go red, boom, and set off the amygdala that's already sensitive and ready to kind of go off at any moment. So those two work together, and so those who are exposed over and over again have a less acute memory to bring up the details, and a really sensitive amygdala setting off. So you can see how that cycle can kind of take place, and it's like kind of like fighting in the dark. And that sense of danger is always there, that shark music that plays. So serotonin plays a really important role. It's a neurotransmitter in the brain of kind of inhibiting those pathways. That also gets reduced in those who have been exposed to high levels of traumatic events. So that sympathetic nervous system that I'm referring to, the fight or flight, the adrenaline, the stress hormones, what that system does once the amygdala sets it off is it increases our breathing rate so that we can take in more oxygen, so that we can fight or run for a longer period of time and our body won't break down. So it's preparing ourselves for that. The heart is beating faster so that oxygen can get to our muscles so that we can fight or run quicker. Our adrenaline increases our energy. We get our senses become keener. Our eyes get bigger. We're taking in more stimulation. Dopamine is released in the body so that if we're cut or hurt in some way, we won't notice the pain, and we'll be able to continue for our survival. Our blood vessels actually move away from our skin All this is involuntary, so that if we're scratched or cut, we won't bleed out as quickly. So these functions are happening anytime we're scared, any event. So even if like somebody jumps out at us while we're walking through our house, or we're asked to speak, or what the heck happened here? Something just, I don't know how that happened, but we'll come back. Sandra, are there any questions in there that just want to check in about that?
No questions.
Okay. Good. All right. So these executive functioning, so it's on my model. So this part of the brain up here, the frontal lobe, this is the part of the brain that's responsible for thinking about future consequences resulting from current actions. So it has all of our ability to inhibit our behavior, to choose between good and bad actions, or better and best, to really think things through, override and suppress unacceptable social responses. All of our reasoning, planning, motivation, drive, all of that exists in this frontal lobe part of the brain. This is everything we want to access in school. So we want that learning, that long-term memories in the frontal lobe. So if the amygdala and hippocampus are getting activated, they're going to set off the lower brain, which means that this frontal lobe part, the reasoning part, is not active. It's not, where we want to get to. So if we have a student that did something and we're standing up over the top of them and maybe raised our voice, and they're little and they're looking up at us and we're yelling, "What were you thinking?" to them, or "What are you thinking?" They may not be thinking with the part of the brain that we want them to think with. They may be just in their lower part of the brain, which is, how do I survive? How do I get out of this situation? I will lie. I will do whatever I need to do just to escape this situation, right? So the example, like, if I'm standing over saying that, as opposed to providing some space, which is hard to do, to demonstrate this online. But if I provide some space and I slow down, and my tone changes, and you can see my hands, and I'm sort of backing up to give you enough space for what's going on. And I say, hey, take a moment, take your time. So, what's going on for you, or what happened? Can you tell me a little bit about that? Right. The difference between the two, of the way I'm talking and the pace that I'm going at and the amount of space I'm giving, I'm communicating directly to your amygdala and hippocampus as best I can to communicate that they're safe in that moment. When the adrenaline goes, it's fast. We have to respond to save our lives, to protect ourselves. So when I'm slowing things down and I'm speaking at a slower pace, I'm regulating myself inside. I'm using a tone that's communicating that of safety. I'm letting the amygdala know you don't have to be activated right now. And hopefully the hippocampus is able to pick up on that and go, okay, this is not danger. Or, especially if I have a relationship with the person, they can remember, okay, this is Jeff, he's a safe person. We've established that. I can turn off the fight or flight response. And then I can activate my frontal lobe, and I can sit and think about, what happened, and we can discuss it. And there can be learning that takes place. We've all experienced this. We've all experienced times in our life when we were triggered. Maybe we were angry in our relationships or with family members, and maybe we said things we didn't mean. And then all of a sudden, like, we calm down and we go, oh my God, I can't believe I said that, right? That's the executive functioning getting back online. So we all go in and out of this to some extent. So it's those who are exposed go into it a little bit more. So coming back to this part around the importance of creating safety. And the activation, when we create safety or we slow things down, or the way I'm talking, I'm trying to get the parasympathetic nervous system activated. So this removes the stress hormone from the bloodstream. It brings the blood vessels back, removes the dopamine so that, and kind of, reduces the heart rate, breathing, so that I can feel regulated again and okay. Mindfulness, relaxation can really help with this. But the thing is, when I'm in that triggered state, it's hard to remember those things because we remember that here. So sometimes somebody else has to stay regulated to bring us back, to activate that frontal lobe. So go, oh yeah, okay. I'll remember that those things are helpful for me. Okay, so let's do those. So any sort of self-regulation, self-soothing strategies, breathing exercises. And one of the best ones I've seen is, so as I was talking about the sympathetic nervous system, or when the fight or flight goes off, what that means is I need to take in more oxygen than I'm putting out because I need my body to be prepared for fighting, flighting, right? But the thing about the breath is that it's both an involuntary function and a voluntary function. So voluntarily, I can override my breathing. And if I'm not paying attention to it, it will just involuntarily take care of itself, but I can voluntarily override it. So if I'm in a state where I need to kind of relax, if I just, pull out my phone here, I'll pull it out for a second. And if I can breathe out longer than I'm breathing in, I am sending a message to my brain that that we're safe. So if I breathe in for 4 seconds, if I just go and breathe out for 6. Do it again. In 4, out 6. So even just doing that for 30 seconds or a minute sends a message to my brain and activates my parasympathetic nervous system, so that I'm saying I don't need more oxygen in my bloodstream in this moment. I don't need to fight or flight, and then it can kind of slow down those things. And so that strategy can be really helpful. But once again, if we're activated and the front of our brain isn't going, we won't remember it in that state, or that'll seem like ridiculous to do. So, but if somebody else around us is doing that, they regulate. And there's a lot of evidence around mirror neurons, that if I stay regulated, it helps your mirror neurons stay regulated. If I'm sending a message, I'm safe, it helps you be safe. So that's one of the most helpful things we can do for others, is to regulate our own self, and this is one way of doing it. So the good news around is around the plasticity of the brain. So you used to think that these the amygdala is swelling, the hippocampus is dwindling, that those things wouldn't come back. And what they're finding is that the brain is very plastic, meaning that those things can sort of regrow, or there can be other parts that take over that. We can redevelop those things. So as much time as possible that we are in safe, predictable environments with connected attachments, where we are receiving positive reinforcement, where we're having mastery experiences, where we're playing and creating and expressing ourselves freely. We're feeling connected to peers, to mental health people, to school psychs, to teachers, to principals. Each time that happens, there's we call it sort of serotonin and dopamine blasts. These are neurotransmitters in the brain that are working to rebuild those parts of the brain. And every time that happens, we're rebuilding more and more. And so what better place than school for us to be able to do that, to have that sort of predictability and those positive experiences. All are invisible to us. We can't see what's happening or how it's impacting a child's brain. But all of the research and some amazing advancements in neurobiology are showing that those things, those experiences, those connections, those attachments that we're developing, in school and at home, and safe, longer periods of safety, are rebuilding those parts of the brain and really healing folks. Now, this is challenging because, as we said, some of our students come in with very sensitive amygdalas, hippocampuses that pick up on any stimuli kind of might trigger it. So we have no idea how much exposure or what's going on there. So we don't know how long it'll take before it begins to show a difference. But we do know that each time we share, like a PBIS, so like Dawn Dollar, or some type of positive reinforcement, we do know that those are the building blocks that make a difference in somebody's brain, really the only way to do it. So Sandra's going to go into a little bit more. I think we're going to take a little bit of a break, so we'll pause the video. But Sandra's going to go into a little bit more time about how to apply some of the things that we've talked about. So Sandra,
I think we'll have a 5-minute video that'll give us, Jeff and I, time to change for me to share my screen, but feel free to get up, walk around, regroup, and then we're back in 5, guys.
We'll come back at 9:18.
Thank you. Jeff, I think you might have to toggle to my name and then make me the host again so that I can then share my screen.
Jeff, you're doing a great job, man. Doing a fabulous job.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it.
Hard to follow that, Glenn. It's very hard to follow that now.
Are you going next, Sandra?
I am.
Oh, you'll do great. I have faith in you.
So how do I get, stop sharing for a moment. Share the screen. There we go.
I'm good. Good. All right, so this next part of the training is really looking at what does this mean for the schools? What does this mean for our classrooms? Why are schools addressing trauma, or why should we be addressing trauma, right? So the goals for today, or this part of the training, is to really discuss the impacts of trauma on students, and not only the students, but their parents, staff, and schools, and identify those trauma-informed strategies or practices that teachers and support staff, as you all, can utilize to support these students. And as we discuss the importance of children feeling safe and supported, it's also important for us to recognize that staff also need to feel safe and supported, and that staff also needs to get what they need. So we'll be touching upon that as well, and offering some strategies and supports for staff working with these students. So understanding trauma is not just about acquiring the knowledge. So Jeff provided a lot of information about trauma, the different types of trauma, right? The physiology of the brain and how it's impacted. And we really want to move towards recognizing the prevalence of trauma and how it impacts the brain, just as Jeff was discussing earlier. We want to recognize impacts on the brain and how it is manifested in the way we behave. So looking past the behavior, and really understanding why students are behaving the way they are. Understanding the importance of regulating students before trying to reason or problem solve, and disciplining those students. So again, really important to talk about what Jeff said is those coping strategies, right? That strategy he mentioned about in for the 4, out for the 6, those types of things that we really want to start doing before we try to have this conversation with them when they're not ready to have that conversation. It's not going to be effective in that moment in time. And then we really want to manage the nonverbal and paraverbal communication. So really being aware of the messages we are sending with our body language, our stance, our tone, our rate of speech. And these are all things that if you've participated in the nonviolent crisis intervention training, these are all things that are gone over in that training. So if you haven't had an opportunity to participate in this training, I highly encourage you to participate, because they talk a lot about that and how effective that can be, not for any student that you're working with, not only one that may have experienced trauma. And we really want to start moving away from focusing on changing only the child. Sometimes it's a lot more effective and easier, and looking at staff and the environment and how we can change our approach and how we can change those environmental factors. How can we make changes within that classroom setting, within the school setting, to support these students? We want to move away from treating behavior as only a discipline issue, and really seeing that behavior as manipulative, controlling, attention-seeking, or willful for that matter. And really, again, going back to why is a student behaving the way they are? There is a possible explanation for that. And again, moving away from what is wrong with you, and again, what happened to you, to be understanding of that student. So I'm going to play this video for you all. I'm hoping that you can hear it. Can you hear that, Jeff? So again, there's so many things that our students are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and we really want to be supportive, right? What are the things that that are in their backpacks as they're entering our schools, as they're entering our classrooms. So again, really moving away from what is wrong with you to, again, what happened to you and understanding that. So what may you observe in young children? And Jeff kind of hit on some of these things, but again, we're gonna look at young children, and then we'll look at middle school and high school students and what we may see in them. So remember, young children do not always have the words to tell us what has happened to them or how they feel. So behavior is a better gauge, and sudden changes in those behaviors obviously can be a sign of trauma exposure. Can everyone see the PowerPoint now? Are you okay, Jeff? Anyone? Because I can't see the chat. I can't see any responses.
You're good. Everything's
okay. Perfect. So what you may see in a young child, this is preschool, elementary, is separation anxiety, right? Or they're clinging towards a teacher, their primary caregivers, as they're dropping them off at school or even within that home setting. There's increased distress. They're unusually whiny, irritable, or moody, and there is no real explanation for that. Regression and previously mastered stages of development. So again, maybe they're resorting back to that baby talk, or they're bedwetting, or they're having toileting accidents at home or even at school. So that's something to look out for. That lack of developmental progress, and that's something that Jeff alluded to earlier, is not progressing at the same level as their peers. And recreating that traumatic event. So again, repeatedly talking about or playing out that event, or even drawing the event. And how many of us working with young kids have seen that, right? And we've sat with students who have drawings, right? And they're explaining to us what may have happened. Difficulty at nap time or bedtime, so they're avoiding sleep, they're waking up, they're having nightmares, they're just restless in their sleep. And then over or under reacting to bells, so these potential triggers, physical contact, door slamming, sirens, lightning, sudden movements. And I've experienced it as a school psychologist. I had a student in the past who was very fearful of helicopters. So anytime there was a helicopter, right, we had a plan in place to support that student, because again, this was a potential trigger for her. Additional things that you may see in students and young children, so again, preschool, elementary, is that increased somatic complaints, those headaches or stomach aches. Those are our students that are continuously visiting the office to see the nurse, right? They're overreacting to minor bumps or bruises at recess time. Or you see just changes in their behavior. Their appetite is changed, unexplained absences, or just angry outbursts. Decreased attention, so they're kind of going off into space, very distractible, or withdrawn, so they're not having those interactions that maybe they were with their peers. They're isolating themselves from their peer group, or even from other staff members that maybe they had really good relationships with. Hyperarousal, so sleep disturbances, tendency to be easily startled, again, close proximity to them, touching them without warning, also can impact these students. They're worrying about recurrence of that violent or that traumatic event. They may have new fears of the dark, so now all of a sudden they want to sleep with the light on, or they want to sleep with a stuffed animal, or they're talking more about monsters, right, for our younger kiddos. Statements about and questions about death and dying may also be something coming up with this age group. And then avoidance behaviors. So they're resisting going to places that remind them of that event, right? Some of our students might not want to go into the restroom, right? Especially because they're having to go in there alone, and that might be a trigger for them. Or other locations within the community, a park, or anything that might trigger or a reminder of the event. And then emotional numbing, again, just seeming to have no feeling about the event whatsoever and not wanting to talk about it. For high school students or middle school students, you're going to see much of the same things. They're going to have that anxiety or fear, worry about their safety of themselves or others, their friends, their family members. They worry about the recurrence of that violence, right? So that seems to be a big factor for them. They have increased risk for substance abuse, especially, high school students. You're going to see that start happening. Repetitive thoughts and comments about death or dying, so including those suicidal thoughts. How many of us, as we're doing any threat assessments or suicide risk assessments, are we looking through notebooks, right? Or artwork that contains some morbid topics or images. So we may see some of those things as well, or internet searches, right, about some of these topics. We're going to see overall changes in their behavior, decreased attention or concentration within the classroom, which ultimately is going to impact their academic performance or their memory. Increased activity level, again, changes in that academic performance. Irritability with friends, teachers, or at certain times of the year. Also, angry outbursts and or aggression, right? And it could be towards their loved ones. It could be towards their peers, towards staff members on campus. And then withdrawal from others or activities, and then an increased rate of absenteeism. Some additional things that you may see with this population, again, increased somatic complaints, just like with our younger population, the headaches, the stomach aches, chest pains, discomfort with feelings, such as troubling thoughts of revenge, repeated discussion of events and focus on that specific detail of what happened. So again, some of us who may be working with students on a one-to-one basis, they may be talking about that particular event and almost perseverating on it as they're discussing it with us. Over or under reacting to bells, physical contact, again, just like with our younger population, or even door slamming, sirens, lightning, because again, these might be potential triggers for them, or any sudden movements. Re-experiencing the trauma, so again, nightmares, that restless sleep might come into play as well. And I'm sorry about that. Oops, there you go. Hyperarousal, again, those sleep disturbances tending to be easily startled. And again, if you're lacking in sleep, if you're not getting too much rest, if you're easily distracted, that's obviously going to impact your memory, and it's going to impact your academic performance as well. Avoidance behaviors, resistant going to places that remind them of that event. And then again, that emotional numbing. You might not see them having any feelings about the event, and that's also of concern. The next slide is really just a really good infograph, and it breaks down all of these things, all of these factors that we looked at into the different developmental domains. I encourage you to look at that. You can even print it, and you can share it with staff as well. So again, it really just highlights everything into the different developmental domains for you. So what have the effects of the last 6 months of being at home, social distancing, what are the effects of the pandemic? Jeff alluded to this as well. What are the things that we're going to be seeing in the classroom? What are the things that we're going to be even seeing in that virtual classroom, or how are students being impacted by that? So students have really lost a routine of being in school, which has impacted their sleep-wake cycle. For my children alone, we had a really set routine when they were in school. Now that they've been off in distance learning, that kind of went off the wayside. As much as we try to keep a routine, they are going to sleep later, they're waking up later, and so it's definitely impacting that sleep and wake cycle. Having expectations to complete work and engage in non-preferred activities, obviously, we're just starting the school year, but distance learning is not, they're not used to that. It's not that traditional way of being in the classroom and having to follow those expectations, complete work in an allotted amount of time, right? All of those routines that you see in the traditional classroom are not happening, right? So that can be very impactful to our students right now. Again, following a set routine or schedule, even though we're trying to embed a routine and a schedule with distance learning, again, it's not that same routine that they were used to, that they were accustomed to in a traditional classroom setting. Following rules and being asked to do things in specific ways right now, the fact that maybe for elementary, they're on 40 minutes for or 60 minutes for synchronous time, right? The rest of the time is asynchronous, and really it's upon them to do the work at their leisure. So again, they're not being asked to, you have to do X by this time, Y by that time. So again, that might be impacting them as they, especially as they return back to the classroom setting and being able to follow those rules. More time is being spent online and with electronics. And the research says that increased screen time is associated with lower psychological well-being, so a lot more depression and anxiety. And so when I talk about being on those tablets, and if they're playing any video games or anything like that, think about the immediate gratification that they receive, right? That immediate reinforcement with all of the colors and you know, they press a button and they win something, and so it's again that immediate reinforcement, and so those kids are really getting accustomed and adjusted to that. So really concerning. Increased distractibility, obviously, and interacting cooperatively with others. So think about those students that had difficulties making friends and establishing those social connections when they were in the classroom. Now, as we're social distancing, as we're doing distance learning, that becomes more difficult for some of these students, and being able to reach out to their friends and their peers to continue those connections has really been impacted. There's also an impact of trauma on our parents that we see on our campuses. Parents or adult caregivers with a history of trauma themselves, and particularly chronic trauma, may struggle with many of the same challenges that we just described for our young population, for our middle school and high school population. Parents with negative or traumatic experiences related to school may be very distrustful of educators, of the school system, the education system, and may have trouble forming relationships with school staff. So we need to be very mindful of that. They're at increased risk of substance abuse, depression, PTSD, that negatively impact their ability to parent our students. And they have trouble managing stress related to their child's difficult behaviors. How many times have we been interviewing a parent, right, and they're telling us just, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I try my best. I just don't know. They sound frustrated, right? And so they're feeling a lot of stress and trying to manage and deal with their child's behavior. And at the same rate, there may be some feelings of embarrassment or shame from some of our parents, even fear or guilt about their child's behaviors or needs. And so that may prompt a lot of our parents who we're trying to schedule meetings with them, SSTs or whatever we're doing to support the student, and we're having a hard time getting the parent to show up for the meeting. So again, is this something that the parent is going through as well? And they have difficulty helping their children cope. So it's really important, not only as we're talking about supporting the students, but also really reaching out to parents and supporting the parents and really building those relationships with the parents too, so that we can help them through this process and provide them the resources and the supports they need to effectively manage their students or their child's behavior. And then there are the impact of trauma on staff. Charles Figley, if any of you know him, says there is a cost to caring. So trauma really takes a toll on children, families, schools, and the community as a whole. But it also takes a huge toll on the school professionals working with these students. Any educator who works directly with traumatized children or adolescents is vulnerable to the effects of trauma. So this is often referred to as vicarious trauma. You might hear the term compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. And really what that is being physically, mentally, or emotionally worn out, or feelings overwhelmed by that student's trauma. So we really want to be mindful and being aware of these signs that educators with vicarious trauma may be exhibiting, right? And it could have impacted any one of us as we're supporting those students that are having difficulties in the classroom setting and the school setting. So some signs, symptoms that may include and are not limited to these. So increased irritability or impatience with the student, increased anxiety. So we're having difficulties regulating our own emotions, right? We're becoming frustrated. And again, a lot of it is coming from a place that we don't know what else to do. We don't know how to reach this student, right? And so we're becoming impatient with the student. Difficulty planning classroom activities and lessons, difficulty with concentration or reduced energy. So again, if you're having those difficulty concentrating or you're having that reduced energy because you're just mentally exhausted about thinking, how else can I support this student, right? You're gonna have difficulties planning your classroom activities, your lessons, because you're simply exhausted. Denying the traumatic event students, or you're feeling numb or detached, right, with regards to that particular student situation. So again, not looking at what's happened to this student, right? Instead is thinking of, you know, what's wrong with him or her. And again, moving towards that shift of, you know, what has happened to him or her, how can we help him? Difficulty managing responses to students and parents. You're going to also see diminished capacity to maintain positive teacher-student and teacher-parent relationships, right? If you're frustrated, it may become apparent with that teacher-student relationship, or even as you're communicating with parents. You might see it in poor attendance or work performance. You just don't want to come to work, right? You're so overwhelmed, you're frustrated, you're stressed, and it's very hard for you, for us to get out of bed and come into work and again deal with that situation. How are we going to help this student? So many things going through your mind that can be very overwhelming. And you have increased feelings of intrusive thoughts that don't lessen over time about that student's trauma. So again, we tend to start perseverating on the student's trauma. And then dreams, you start having dreams about the student's trauma. I don't know if it's happened to any of you, but as we're working with kiddos that are very challenging, right? And we're going in to support the administrator, the teacher. Again, we start thinking about this at night, and we start having these dreams about them, and again, what happened during that day. So again, these are all signs or symptoms of a staff member that can be going through this. Sorry, Jeff, what did you say?
So, well, a couple things. One, I was letting people know it's 9:45, and I know we're scheduled to 9:45. We're going to continue the presentation you have
Oh
to
my
go,
God.
then that's okay. You can watch the recording later. And Sandra, you removed that white box, so we were good on that. So we'll go ahead and continue.
There's a white box on there. Can you see now?
Not anymore. It's gone. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So the impact of trauma on schools, there's a high rate of trauma among students and staff that can have a significant negative impact on school climate, culture, and conditions for learning. So students struggling with trauma responses are more likely to escalate and act out in ways that can compromise their safety, and then the safety of other students and staff members as well on the campus. So in an environment of fear and crisis, adults may become, not all, become more increasingly rigid and reactive. So adults may be very quick, right, to threaten students with negative consequences. So again, we resort to those punitive measures, which may escalate the students, and the use of more disciplined strategies in an attempt to regain or try to regain that control, which may not be effective. Under these circumstances, we run the risk of re-traumatizing those students. And I believe Edgar had made a comment to that in the chat earlier, about yelling at a student and how that can bring back the trauma for a student, which is absolutely correct. And so with all of these factors comes an increased risk for harm, and then obviously a decrease in academic achievement. So when we're looking at trauma-sensitive practices or trauma-informed care, we want to recognize that the care that recognizes a trauma changes a brain, and that these neurological changes affect every area of the student's life. So again, very much like what Jeff was discussing earlier, the physiology of the brain, the environment that creates a sense of safety. So we're going to be talking a lot about what you can do in the classroom setting, in the school setting, to create that sense of safety. And then understanding what lies behind those negative behaviors. So looking past the behavior and what is really the child trying to say or the student trying to say, and really looking at focusing on relationships and not just the behaviors. So looking at the importance of the relationship between you and the student, and also the student with his peer group, and really forming that bond with his peers is going to be really important. So how can you assist a student who is coping with trauma? We talked about this a lot. Jeff mentioned it, is looking beyond the behavior, understanding that trauma explains a behavior. It does not excuse a behavior by any means, but problem behaviors are often due to a desire to self-protect or mechanisms of coping. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So what's really there? So it's important to read the behavior accurately. We want to look beyond the behavior, as the last slide indicated. What feeling or feelings is this behavior masking, right? And as school psychologists, as we're looking at those FBAs, we're really analyzing all of that. We're looking at the behavior that we do see, right? And feeling that it may be masking. So for example, if you have a student that is demonstrating some oppositional behavior, okay, that student may be having a fear of rejection, of abandonment, right? Think about that student at recess time, for example, right? And peers don't want to play with him. It may be that he starts demonstrating this oppositional behavior because he's fearing being rejected by his peers, right? Or no one wants to play with him or her. So again, really important to look at that. Outbursts, physical, verbal outbursts in the classroom. Is a child simply being overwhelmed? Are they trying to escape the work because it is too difficult for them? So again, looking at what does this really mean? Anger. So if they're demonstrating anger, it may be a feeling of hurt, right? Hurt that that child doesn't want to play with him at recess time. Hurt that the student didn't let him play recess, right? So again, really looking at why is this child potentially angry? There's more to it than just him being angry. Defiance of authority, so that need for control or mistrust. Argumentative, he's just maybe testing those relationships that he has with you or with his peers. And that need to control, again, looking at need to rely on themselves, right? They don't want to have anyone else control, because that person might leave, might abandon them. And so they want to have that control. So this is really important, where the choices become quite effective, and provided that structured choice where you can do this or that, right? Because they still feel that they have some control, even though you've kind of structured the control for them. So that strategy becomes really effective in that case. Why isn't it moving forward? Okay. Oops. So triggers in youth. So Jeff talked a lot about that. So what are some things that might trigger our students as they're in the classroom, in our schools, at home as well? Those loud noises, the physical touch without prompting them, without priming them, right? So again, really respecting that personal space, threatening gestures. So again, looking at our palms, our stance, right? How we're approaching them becomes very important, because again, it may be a potential trigger. Authority figures, and really making sure that the limit setting, chaos or uncertainty, particular spaces, bathrooms, or areas that are less monitored. So again, those students that don't like being alone, even sometimes like the quad areas, open areas, especially you have students that may be fearful of helicopters, of the fire engine sirens, things like that. So those spaces might be a trigger for our kiddos. Changes in routine, obviously they want to have that sense of control. Witnessing violence between others, such as even peers fighting, may be a trigger for them. And like I said before, emergency vehicles, police, fire personnel. And then also certain smells, right? Or particular times of year that might remind them of that event. And so some of the triggers that you may see at school or in the classroom. And then common responses to trauma triggers, and Jeff alluded to all of this, those fight responses, which would consist of the yelling, the swearing, posturing, or that aggressive behavior. Those kids that are, maybe coming up to you, becoming confrontational with you, either physically or even verbally. The fight responses are the students that are running away, right? That we're chasing after them in the recess, at recess time in the playground area. We kind of tend to play that cat and mouse game, refusing to talk. They're simply avoiding. And then for our older students, engaging in the substance abuse. And then the freeze responses maybe look like the spacing out, appearing numb, like they don't really care. You might have the gestures where they're just kind of moving their shoulders like, I don't care. Disconnected, just confused, or simply just unresponsive. They might be coming in with their hoodies on, putting their heads down. So again, some of those things that you want to look for. So really important. Now, what do we do in the classroom? How do we support these students? We want to establish a routine and maintain clear communication. So we want to provide that predictable schedule, and make timely announcements of changes when necessary. So again, these students benefit from routine. They want to know what's going to be happening. If you plan on changing anything, please let them know. Sometimes it's really important, especially at the beginning of the day or at the beginning of the period, to do a run through of what you're going to be doing for that day. So again, you're priming those students and they know and anticipate what's going to happen. You want to set clear expectations for the behavior and enforce consistently. So again, we talk back to PBIS and your school-wide matrix, right? So even in distance learning is what are those expectations as you're coming onto a Zoom meet or a Google Meet? And really, talking about those expectations before every activity so students know what to expect, and what the teacher expects of you as well is really important. You want to follow through with your promises, and in situations where plans must change, be transparent with your explanation. So again, if you're going to make a promise to a student, you want to make sure that it's feasible. You want to make sure that you're actually going to go through with it, because the next time you make a promise and you didn't follow through the first time, there's less likelihood that that student's going to buy in, right? And is going to trust you and look at you as that safe person that they trust. You want to use specific praise, like you did a great job paying attention in class today versus a good job today. So you want to label that behavior. In PBIS, and as we're looking at the PBIS framework, one of the strategies is that 5-to-1 strategy, right? So for every 5, positive reinforcements, right? You want to do 5 positive reinforcements for every pre-correction, for every consequence or negative consequence that you provide. And especially you want to reinforce those students that are having more difficulties, right? Your more challenging students. Those are the students that you want to praise more throughout the day. But again, labeling what you saw. So not just, you did a good job, Johnny. No, you did a good job sitting at your seat and listening to me, or you did a good job today playing at recess with Maria. So again, that's the specific praise that you want. They want to see and they want to hear, right, what behavior they engaged in. You want to watch the tone and speed of your voice and words. So really watching how you say things, right? Slow down your tone, softer speech as well they're going to be more receptive to that, as opposed to you talking very fast, very loud, because that can be very confusing to them. And again, you're not going to be able to have that effective conversation with them at that point. So again, think back to those strategies that you learn in CPI, in that nonviolent crisis prevention and intervention training. If you haven't participated in that, I do encourage you to participate, because they talk a lot about this. And so that's not only effective for those kids that have been exposed to trauma, but for any student that may just be having a bad day. So it's really effective. You want to provide choices, right? Some of these students, that has been taken away from them in that traumatic experience that they may have undergone. So really providing choices to them, and structured choices, right? If that's where the if-then strategy comes in. If you do this, then you can get that. That becomes really important. Choice boards, the use of choice boards with these students can be quite effective as well. So again, providing choices, and not just a stance of you need to do it this way, because that's not going to be effective. And then you want to practice building awareness of your own emotions and triggers, and model your own self-regulation skills. So again, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to also take care of yourself before you can help that student. And if that means you need to take a break, or you need to step away for a while to really regroup, that's what you need to do. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a few slides. And you really want to adapt to any changes of the day. So again, practice your own self-regulation skills and coping strategies. And then connect, right? The last slide, help students stay connected to each other. These are ways that students can connect with each other. Consider assigning a fun group work, right, activity, whether you're using breakouts in your Meet or Zoom. This is a good way for students to collaborate with each other and again form those bonds that they had while they were on campus, right, while they were playing at recess time or during passing period or lunchtime. Scavenger hunts during your meets are a good way also of building that connectedness. Just fun challenges that you can incorporate during your meets or when students return back onto campus. You want to continue with those talent shows that you may have had, right? Every Friday could be like a fun Friday and including talent shows or even just a show and tell. How many of our students want to show off their pet or show off something within their home? And so again, brings that connectedness piece back. And then again, shows that, oh, I have something in common with someone else in my class. And then joke of the day, you can include that as part of that morning meeting that you do, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But again, asking students to share a joke of the day, and that can even become a reinforcement for some, right? That they've earned to be able to select the joke of the day, and they can share it through the chat or even verbally during a Meet or a Zoom. Check-in examples, right? As you're checking in with students, these are just some things that you can do. You want to identify and label feelings and emotions. So again, these are just more tailored for elementary students. As you inhale and exhale, observe and describe the type of weather you are experiencing inside your body, right? Or just basically an emotions check-in. On a scale of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, how are you feeling today? This is a very quick check-in that can be used in the chat box, or you can use in a journal as well. But again, just some examples of what that may look like. Another check-in example, very quick, a rosebud and a thorn check-in, and then you would just talk about something that is positive, one challenging or hard thing right now, and then your bud is something you are looking forward to or is currently giving you hope. And there's different variations to that. In the training that we did for engagement strategies, and I put a link to this at the end of this slide deck, there's plenty more examples of potential check-ins that you can use with your students. Others are just a simple 2-word check-in. Pause and reflect on 2 words that describe how you feel today. That can be used as part of a PLC when you're meeting with your staff. It could be used at a staff meeting. Very quick, you can use a chat box to do that, and you can also use that with your students. The mood meter, again, another good strategy. This was developed by Mark Brackett out of Yale, and he is a professor there who is talking a lot about emotional intelligence. And so there's 4 quadrants to the mood meter, and really what looks like is pleasantness, right, and energy. So very low energy to high energy, low levels of pleasantness to high levels of pleasantness. And what that looks like, even for, you can use this for an elementary student, right? The red quadrant is going to be looking at angry, right? Tense, annoyed, those feelings, being frightened. Your yellow quadrant, surprised, excited, happy, helpful. So very few feelings on there. As you're working with more middle school, high school students, you can incorporate more of those feelings and where those feelings would go into the yellow quadrant, red quadrant. Your green is where you're feeling calm, relaxed, right? Peaceful, fulfilled. And then your blue, more low energy, right? Disappointed, sad, helpless, drained. So again, you can use that mood meter as a check-in, and then the wheels of emotion, and you can link here and it'll give you more information on the mood meter and how you would introduce it to staff and also to students. The wheels of emotion, here you'd start with, in the center of the wheel, you start with very basic emotions, angry, fear, happy. And as you work with older students, you work towards the outer part of the wheel, which incorporates a lot more feelings, right? But again, with our little guys, as we're just working on expanding their vocabulary of feelings, we start with that inner circle and then we branch off to the outer circle. Okay, we talked about that virtual scavenger hunt or break that can be used as part of that morning meeting. And again, to build that connectedness and just having fun with students as you're meeting with them. And this can be incorporated as you come back into the classroom. And these are just some examples. Having them find their snack, an item that brings them comfort, their favorite mask, right? There's so many other things that you can include as part of that scavenger hunt. You give them 5 minutes, even 2 minutes, where they can look for things around their home. I just know, in talking to a teacher this past week, science teacher, she incorporated the virtual scavenger hunt with science and asked her students to find objects that were recyclable and to bring them back. So again, she included that in her science class, but again, good way of building that connection and just having fun. You want to create a sense of safety. So you want to reach out to students. You want to be that safe person that they can talk to, right? And if it's not you that they feel connected to, really helping them reach out to someone that they do feel comfortable with and they feel that connection with. So sometimes some of our students feel connected to the custodian, right? It could be the person doing supervision at recess time that they've really connected to. So any trusted or supportive adult that they can reach out to when they're having some difficulties. Others offer students a way to connect if they want to talk about concerns, right, with anyone. And then you also want to help them role play, right? If someone's not responding. The best way and a really good strategy when you're talking about this is, what would you tell your best friend to do, right? And sometimes that becomes a little bit easier for them to problem solve and think like, oh, well, I would tell my friend to do this. So if you pose that question to them, they may be able to come up with strategies or some things that they can follow up with to get some additional help or support. Safe touch, you want to ask permission or give warning before physically touching a student. So again, this might be a trigger to some. So you want to not just approach someone from the back and touch them, but again, ask their permission or again, prime them before you do that. Learn to recognize when a student's emotional responses can no longer be managed safely in the classroom setting and know how and to whom to refer for additional intervention. So all of you guys should have some type of plan at your sites in terms of this happening. Like, who are you going to call? If you're a teacher in the classroom, who are you going to call for additional support if you feel overwhelmed and you can't continue handling that situation? Are you going to, is a procedure to call the office? Do you have a walkie-talkie that you can call for help? So again, making sure that you know, you can no longer support the student and you need some help. Connect caregivers to concrete resources for food, healthcare, and counseling support. So this is when an access referral comes into play. You can reach out to our department, to student services, if you're meeting with parents or parents are vocalizing some concerns in any of these areas, or the student is, and how you can link them for additional support or resources. So safety approaches in the classroom or home. So again, a calming corner. You want to establish a quiet or safe place in the classroom or home environment for students to go when they are feeling overwhelmed. It should be really a comfortable place away from a lot of distractions, with comfortable furniture, blankets, and pillows. So again, doesn't have to be anything fancy, but something quiet. You know, a lot of us use the big pillows, or we put blankets in a corner, and we put a lot of pillows there in a corner of the room, right? We fix it up with certain pictures that are very calming pictures of animals, of the ocean, right? Plants. So, and a lot of teachers have started to do these calming corners in the classroom. Now, what does that look like for distance learning and creating a virtual calming corner, right? Or a virtual calming room that teachers can use, and we as support staff can utilize as well in supporting our students, and also that parents have access to this if they're not able to create a calming corner within their home environment. Some of the things that we would incorporate if it were actually here in the classroom or even at home is have some sensory materials for students, such as small rubber balls that they can squeeze if they're really upset or they just need that fidget. Stuffed animals, right? A lot of our students need that sensory input. So stuffed animals, or even any type of weighted stuffed animals. So they're on Amazon. I know they sell a lot of the really small ones, like little lizards or things like that, that they could place on their lap, especially if that student is needing that sensory input. Pillows with different types of fabric. Again, those students that benefit from that sensory input, they tend to start rubbing on the fabric or even putting it against their face. That may be very soothing to them. Pipe cleaners, if they just need fidgets and they're able to play and manipulate with those pipe cleaners. Rocks, crystals, Play-Doh, again, to fiddle with or play with. And then again, some of our students like to scribble or really just color, and that could be very soothing to them. So having some of these materials in your calming corner, or access to them if we're doing some type of virtual calming room or corner. Have pleasant colors, pictures of nature, like I said before, cute animals in the classroom or in that home environment that students can focus on when they're dysregulated. Incorporate music into the classroom, so very calming music that can be played in the background softly, obviously, and that can be very calming. Or even if you're incorporating that in that calming corner and you have that playing in the background. And then very important, the use of movement breaks or brain breaks. Sometimes in the classroom, we're going to see when our students are starting to become more dysregulated, or they're, you know, out of their seats a lot more. And so they may benefit from that movement break or a brain break, and really trying to get them to regroup. There's a link there to Pure Edge, which offers a lot of examples of some brain breaks and movement breaks that can be incorporated, and they can be incorporated virtually as well. This is just an example of a virtual calming corner room. The link is there. You have access to it. You can adapt it and make it your own. You can run with it. You might want to change the little Bitmoji on there. You can use your own Bitmoji. But again, there's links there to different breathing strategies, visuals, and movements. So again, those brain movements, and again, you can use at your leisure. The link is there, and you can adapt it as you'd like, or you can use it as is. Moving right along, because I know we're running out of time and we're way over time. Mindfulness strategies, you want to model those coping strategies. So again, teach breathing for relaxation. Here are just some samples of some mini meditation guides, bubble breathing, square breathing that can be used through Headspace, Calm app for kids, and also for our middle school and high school population. Additional resources, videos on wellness for, again, more bubble breathing, cooling out breathing, starfish breathing, and then apps for wellness, again, for our young students and also for our middle school and high school population. We talked a lot about morning meetings and check-ins. These examples here are a really good guide for you on how you can structure your morning meeting, right? How you can incorporate the check-in, a mindful minute, right? That breathing activity or whatever you're going to incorporate. So it's a really nice guide on how you can structure that morning meeting, and then also closing out your lesson at the end. The bottom one, morning meeting, that has Monday, August 17th, there is a link there, and that offers you many sample morning meetings. So I believe there's like 2 months worth of morning meetings there, and talks about your morning greeting, right? Your video, right? Your mindfulness video that you may want to show. So it's a really good resource that I would highly encourage you to look at, and you can adapt at your leisure as well. And then a choice board. You can have students choose one of these things that they would do on the choice board. So again, something that you can include. Additional resources, a lot more on the Virtual PD Academy in terms of my slide deck on engagement strategies, and it'll talk about examples of check-ins, examples of community building exercises that you can do with students there. So it's posted on there. And then this is the actual slide deck to that presentation on engagement during remote learning. Additional resources on trauma that you can also resort back to at your leisure. Self-care to prevent vicarious trauma. So again, looking at how you need to take care of yourself as you're working with students, right? Recognize your own feelings first. Just like on an airplane, you must put on your air mask before you can help anybody else. You want to really improve your understanding of trauma. Prioritize seeking support from coworkers, family, or friends. Again, keeping in mind confidentiality. But again, you can't do it alone. So please reach out to your loved ones, to your colleagues. Taking a time out. So the tap in, tap out strategy, really making sure that there's some type of strategy on your campus that when you need a break, you know who to call to. What is a protocol when I need to step away because I just need a break from this situation, from this student, before it escalates. So again, having that ability to tap out and having someone come in and support the students while you take that 2-minute break or that 5-minute break. Prioritize your emotions and safety, and create your own list of go-to self-care strategies. Again, if you can devote 5 to 10 minutes of those self-care strategies on a day-to-day, that's great for you and for your own well-being. And then set boundaries and check in with yourself to process your feelings. So again, put your own mask on first. This is additional support that you can refer to from LACO. So we partner with LACO. This is the Employee Assistance Service for Education. It's a 24/7 hotline. Telehealth options are available. Video counseling, telephone counseling are available. So if you are struggling, if you need to talk to someone else, this is one more resource for staff here in our district to resort to, and the information is here for you. And there's also more information in this video. Okay. And again, if we only knew what happened last night or this morning before he or she got to school, we would be shielding the same child we're now reprimanding. So remember, relationships before rigor, grace before grades, patience before programs, and love before lessons. I really encourage you to look at this video. It's a great video. I'm not going to show it because we've definitely run out of time, but it really goes back to really understanding what a student, what our youth has gone through, and that may be explaining why they're behaving and why they're doing what they're doing as they come onto our schools and our classrooms. That's it. I ran through that very quickly, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandra. That was great. The emails that were just up right there. So jmiddleton@ERUSD. So that's my email. And then Sandra S. Robles @ERUSD.org. So we'll share the slide deck with everybody on this training. So you have access to that. Some of the things, if you want to go back and look at, that Sandra went through you know, quickly you might have, or some of the videos and some of those resources are great. So feel free to go back and look at those. And then anybody else watching this recording later can contact us and we can share it with you as well, so that you have access to that slide deck.
Yeah, the last video is a very powerful video. It's about 5 to 6 minutes long, and talks about a young adult now looking back at being in school and the importance of a relationship he had with the staff member there, and going back and visiting that staff member as an adult. But really powerful. I highly encourage you to take a look at it.
All right, stop it.